Ever had your day ruined by a letter? Wait until you see how a bulldozer turns things around. I thought it was just a regular morning until a letter arrived that changed everything. A barrier was put in place to block my family's only access to our land by someone who clearly didn't understand the consequences of messing with the wrong people. What followed was far from what anyone expected. You're about to see how an old Marine, with a bulldozer and a whole lot of heart, made sure things didn't stay that way. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Leave a comment below and hit like if you're curious to see what happens next. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, tucked between my electric bill and a pizza coupon like it belonged there. Bright red lettering across the top screamed "Violation Notice" in bold caps, and underneath, in smaller print that somehow felt more threatening, it read, "Unauthorized use of private roadway. Immediate cessation required." I stared at the paper, coffee mug halfway to my lips, trying to process what I was reading. This was the road I'd driven down every single day for the past 5 years since inheriting the house from my grandfather. The same road my family had used for 4 decades. The same road that was literally the only way to reach my front door without hiking through half a mile of Texas scrubland. The letter was signed by Stephanie Foster, President, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'd heard the name whispered around the neighborhood coffee shop, usually followed by eye rolls and muttered complaints, but I'd never actually met the woman. Stephanie's life hadn't been easy since her messy divorce. Losing her mansion, the life she once knew, and the status that came with it, she had become someone obsessed with control. Every decision, every change she made in Willowbrook Estates was a desperate attempt to regain what she had lost. The HOA was her fortress, her last hope to build a new empire. The kind of changes that had longtime residents like Betty Johnson shaking their heads and talking about the good old days, when neighbors actually talked to each other instead of sending violation notices. I made a call to Mike at City Hall, but the conversation was nothing like I expected. "Jake, it's bad. Stephanie's making a power play. If you want to challenge her, you better have something solid, like legal easement." It was the kind of talk that made my head spin. Easement rights, city permits, too much to digest. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was a pause, then a long sigh. "Oh man, you got hit by the Foster hurricane too? Jake, I've had 12 calls this week about that woman. She's got some kind of crusade going on about unauthorized access and property values. Look, if you've got legal easement rights, she can't touch you, but you're gonna need to prove it." The confidence in his voice gave me hope, but the underlying weariness told me this wasn't going to be as simple as showing up with a few old documents. The legal stuff was complicated, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. Mike had been right. If we wanted to win, it wouldn't be through endless paperwork. We needed something more immediate, more tangible. Every blade of grass was exactly the same height. The mailbox gleamed like it had just rolled off the assembly line, and there wasn't a single leaf or twig anywhere on the perfectly swept driveway. I rang the doorbell and waited, hearing the sound of heels clicking rapidly across hardwood floors. When the door opened, I found myself face to face with a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate training video. Navy blue blazer, crisp white shirt, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. "You must be Jake Parker," she said before I could introduce myself. Her voice was smooth and professional, but there was something underneath it that reminded me of the sound my garbage disposal makes when it's about to break. "I've been expecting you. I assume you're here about the violation notice." I nodded, trying to maintain my friendliest smile. "Yes, ma'am, I was hoping we could talk about this. See, that road has been used by my family since my grandfather bought this property back in 1985, and I've got the paperwork to prove it's a legal easement." For just a moment, something flickered across her face, almost like vulnerability or maybe recognition that this wasn't going to be as easy as she'd hoped. When I saw her at the meeting, there was something in her eyes, frustration, maybe fear. It wasn't just about the road or the fence anymore. She was losing control, and the tight grip she held over the community was slipping. For the first time, I saw vulnerability. But it didn't last. In seconds, she was back to her corporate persona, cold and calculated. "You have 30 days to find alternative access to your property, or you'll face a fine of $500 per day." The way she delivered this information, like she was reading from a script, made my blood pressure spike. Alternative access? "Ma'am, there is no alternative access. That road is literally the only way to get to my house." unless I want to build a helicopter pad." She shrugged, and that shrug told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Parker. I'm sure a resourceful person like yourself can figure something out. Good day." And with that, she closed the door in my face, leaving me standing on her perfect doorstep like some kind of unwanted solicitor. As I walked back home, I could feel her watching me from behind her pristine white curtains, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that I'd just declared war without realizing it. That evening, I called my grandfather, Hank Davis, a 78-year-old former Marine who'd built his construction company from nothing and still went to the gym every morning at 5 a.m. "Grandpa, I need some advice. The new HOA president is trying to block access to the house." There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had that dangerous calm that I remembered from my childhood whenever someone tried to mess with our family. "Jake, in the Marines we had a saying, 'No one left behind.' But out here in civilian life, the saying is, 'No one messes with family land. Tell me everything.'" As I filled him in on the details, I could practically hear the gears turning in his military-trained mind, and I knew that Stephanie Foster had no idea what kind of storm she'd just started. The next morning, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. If Stephanie Foster wanted to play hardball, I needed to understand who I was dealing with. My first stop was Tom Wilson's house, 3 doors down from mine. Tom had been dealing with HOA issues for the past year, and from what I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine, he'd gotten a taste of Stephanie's management style firsthand. When I knocked on his door, Tom opened it with the expression of a man who'd been through a war and lived to tell about it. "Let me guess," he said before I could speak. "You got the red letter too." We sat on his back porch with coffee while Tom filled me in on what I was really up against. "Jake, that woman made me cut down a 50-year-old oak tree because it violated the height restrictions in the HOA guidelines. A tree that was here before this neighborhood even existed. And the kicker? The height restriction she cited was in a subsection about fence posts, not trees. When I tried to argue, she brought 3 compliance officers to my house, volunteers from the neighborhood who follow her around like she's some kind of general." Tom's hands shook slightly as he spoke, and I could see the genuine frustration and exhaustion in his eyes. But the story that really got my attention was about Mrs. Henderson, an 80-year-old widow who lived at the end of the block. Stephanie fined her $200 for hanging her laundry incorrectly. Apparently, the clothesline was supposed to run east-west, not north-south. Mrs. Henderson had been hanging her clothes the same way for 15 years, but Stephanie found some obscure rule buried in page 47 of the HOA guidelines. The poor woman was so stressed she ended up in the emergency room with chest pains. Tom's voice got quieter as he continued. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with someone who was just overzealous about rules. This woman has some kind of deeper issue. After leaving Tom's house, I decided to dig a little deeper into Stephanie's background. A quick search online revealed some interesting details about her recent history. She'd been married to David Foster, a successful real estate developer in Dallas, until their divorce was finalized 6 months ago. According to the public records I could find, she'd lost their 8,000 square foot mansion in the settlement and had been forced to downsize significantly. The house she was living in now was probably a tenth the size of what she was used to, and for someone who seemed to thrive on control and status, that had to be a massive psychological blow. I also discovered that Stephanie had quickly surrounded herself with a support network that was more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. Richard Brooks, a local real estate agent who served on the HOA board, seemed to be her primary ally, but the more I looked into their relationship, the more questionable it became. Richard's company had been awarded several contracts for property improvements around the neighborhood since Stephanie took office, and the amount seemed unusually high for the type of work being done. A $15,000 contract to upgrade common area lighting that resulted in 4 new streetlights, a $20,000 landscaping enhancement project that planted some bushes and repaved a 50-foot section of sidewalk. The most disturbing discovery was the surveillance network Stephanie had established. What I'd initially assumed were standard security cameras were actually part of a comprehensive monitoring system covering most of the common areas and several strategic locations that provided clear views into residents' yards. Tom confirmed that several neighbors had been approached by Stephanie's compliance officers, asking them to report on their neighbors' activities in exchange for reduced HOA fee. It was like living in a small-scale police state where everyone was watching everyone else and reporting back to the central authority. That afternoon, I received a call from Grandpa Hank. "Jake, I've been making some inquiries about your HOA situation. Turns out I've got some contacts in the city planning office from my construction days. Want to know something interesting about that road you're fighting over?" His voice had that tone that meant he'd discovered something important. "Shoot, Graham." "Well, according to the records I found, that road wasn't built with HOA funds or city funds. It was built in 1985 with private money, specifically money from your grandfather Samuel, Tom Wilson's father, and 2 other property owners who needed access to their land. That makes it a private easement funded by private individuals, not HOA common property." The implications of this discovery hit me like a freight train. If the road had been built with private funds by the property owners who needed it, then Stephanie had no legal authority to restrict access. It wasn't HOA property at all. It was a private easement with legal rights that predated the HOA's authority. "Grandpa, this changes everything. If we can prove the funding source, we can prove she has no jurisdiction." Hank's chuckle came through the phone like the sound of distant thunder. "That's not all, Jake. I've been doing some reconnaissance on this Stephanie Foster character. Turns out she's got bigger problems than just throwing her weight around with HOA rules. Someone's been asking questions about missing HOA funds, and word is getting around that the books don't add up." As I hung up the phone, I felt the first real surge of hope I'd had since this whole mess started. Stephanie Foster wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was potentially a criminal who'd been using her position to cover up financial irregularities. And if Grandpa Hank was getting involved, with his network of contacts and his military approach to problem solving, this war was about to shift dramatically in our favor. The question was, how far was Stephanie willing to go to protect her position, and what was she really trying to hide? I woke up Thursday morning to the sound of construction equipment rumbling down our usually quiet street. By the time I'd thrown on clothes and made it outside, a small crowd of neighbors had already gathered to watch a crew of workers unloading wooden fence posts, stacks of cedar planks, and what looked like enough materials to build a small fort. Stephanie Foster stood in the middle of it all, wearing a hard hat that looked like it had never seen actual construction work. Clipboard in hand, directing the operation like some kind of twisted suburban general. Before we went in full throttle with the bulldozer, I made a call. Maria had been working on a loophole, something about HOA not following due process when it came to the permits. If we could prove this was an illegal act, it would be a win without wrecking the place. But I knew one thing for sure. If that didn't work, the bulldozer would. But the real kicker was the industrial-grade floodlights they were installing every 20 feet along the fence line. When I asked one of the workers about the lights, he shrugged and said, "Lady wants them bright enough to see from space. 24/7 operation, motion sensors, the whole 9 yards." By noon, my quiet country road looked like the perimeter of a medium-security prison. The construction noise brought out more neighbors than I'd seen gathered in one place since the annual block party 3 years ago. Betty Johnson, the 67-year-old retired teacher who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, was the first to march up to Stephanie and demand an explanation. "Young lady, what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing? That road serves 5 families, not just the Parkers." Stephanie's response was delivered with the kind of cold professionalism that would have made a corporate lawyer proud. "Mrs. Johnson, this fence is being erected for security and safety purposes as authorized by the HOA board under emergency safety provisions. All affected residents were notified by certified mail." Betty's response was immediate and explosive. "Emergency safety provisions, my foot! The only emergency around here is you trying to turn our neighborhood into some kind of gated prison. And for your information, I never received any certified mail." This led to a heated argument that drew even more neighbors out of their houses, and within an hour, we had about 15 people standing around watching Stephanie try to defend her fence project. The crowd included Tom Wilson, who brought a lawn chair and a bag of popcorn like he was settling in for a movie, and even Mrs. Henderson, the 80-year-old widow who'd been terrorized over her clothesline. The most surreal moment came when Stephanie tried to climb onto one of the fence posts to address the crowd, lost her balance, and fell backward into a muddy hole that the construction crew had dug for a support post. She emerged covered in Texas clay from head to toe, her perfect blonde hair now resembling a muddy bird's nest, while the construction workers tried very hard not to laugh. Tom Wilson didn't even try to hide his amusement, and Betty Johnson offered to lend Stephanie a garden hose to clean off. The image of our dictatorial HOA president sitting in a mud hole while trying to maintain her authority was something I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. That evening, Stephanie called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she termed community resistance to necessary safety improvements. The meeting was held in the community center, a a small building that usually hosted birthday parties and baby showers, but tonight it was packed with 40 angry residents instead of the usual 6 or 7. Stephanie had clearly prepared for a battle, arriving with Richard Brooks, 2 other board members I didn't recognize, and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the HOA's legal counsel. The meeting started with Stephanie presenting a PowerPoint presentation about perimeter security and liability management, complete with charts and graphs that looked impressive but didn't actually explain why she'd decided to barricade a road that had been used safely for 40 years. When she got to the slide about unauthorized access creating insurance liability, Betty Johnson stood up and interrupted. "Stephanie, I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and the only liability I see is you. That road was built with money from the residents who needed it, not with HOA funds, and you have no right to block it." The room erupted in applause, and I could see Stephanie's carefully maintained composure starting to crack. Her voice got higher and more strained as she tried to regain control of the meeting. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand that change can be difficult, but as president of this HOA, I have both the authority and the responsibility to make decisions that protect property values and ensure community safety. The fence will remain in place, and any attempts to damage or remove it will result in legal action." The lawyer next to her nodded grimly, like he was already calculating his billable hours. But then something unexpected happened. Tom Wilson stood up, and instead of arguing with Stephanie, he started telling the story of his oak tree, the clothesline incident with Mrs. Henderson, and several other examples of what he called Stephanie's reign of terror. Other residents began sharing their own stories. Fines for having the wrong color mailbox, violations for parking in their own driveways incorrectly, warnings about grass that was allegedly half an inch too long. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Stephanie's fence wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of increasingly authoritarian behavior that had been building for months. As people filed out of the meeting, I noticed Stephanie sitting alone on the stage, staring at her hands, while Richard Brooks and the lawyer packed up their materials. For just a moment, she looked less like a tyrant and more like a woman who was in over her head and didn't know how to get out. But then she looked up and saw me watching her, and the vulnerable expression disappeared, replaced by a look of cold determination that told me this fight was far from over. Whatever was driving Stephanie Foster to behave this way, it was something deeper than just power trips and control issues. The question was, what was she really afraid of, and how far was she willing to go to protect herself from it? The morning after the HOA meeting, I found myself staring at legal documents that had been taped to my front door sometime during the night. The papers were from something called Brooks and Associates Legal Services, and informed me that I was being charged with trespassing, harassment, and intentional interference with lawful HOA operations. According to the documents, I had 5 days to cease all hostile activities against the HOA and its representatives, or face a lawsuit seeking $50,000 in damages plus attorney fees. I immediately called Maria Benson, a real estate attorney who lived 2 streets over and had a reputation for not backing down from bullies. Maria had been at the HOA meeting the night before, and from the way she'd been taking notes during Stephanie's presentation, I had a feeling she'd been expecting something like this. "Jake, this is intimidation, pure and simple. They're hoping to scare you into submission before you can challenge their authority. The good news is that most of these charges are completely baseless. The bad news is that defending against a lawsuit, even a frivolous one, can be expensive and time-consuming." Over coffee in Maria's kitchen, she explained the legal realities of my situation. The easement issue is straightforward. If you can prove that the road was built with private funds for private access, you have legal rights that predate any HOA authority. But Stephanie's playing a different game now. She's trying to bury you in legal costs and stress until you give up and go away. It's a common tactic among HOAs that have been taken over by people with too much time and not enough actual problems to solve. Maria's assessment was blunt but honest. I was probably going to win in the long run, but the short term was going to be expensive and miserable. Maria gave me the basics. "Jake, if the easement was funded privately, then the HOA has no leg to stand on. The rest is a formality. Let's focus on making it count." I nodded, hoping we weren't overthinking it. The hearing is scheduled for next week. The implications were staggering. If Stephanie could get a restraining order, she could effectively silence any opposition to her policies while she consolidated her power. But the most disturbing development came that evening when I discovered that Stephanie had hired a private security company to patrol the neighborhood. The guard, a large man in a uniform that looked like it belonged to mall security, was stationed right next to the new fence, with instructions to document any suspicious activity around the barrier. When I walked down to check my mailbox, he started following me with a clipboard, writing down everything I did. The psychological pressure was intense. I felt like I was being watched and judged for simply existing in my own neighborhood. Hank looked at the bulldozer, then at me. "You know, Jake, there's another way. We could expose the truth behind the fence. Legal records, city permits, but I suppose if we have to, a bulldozer could make a bigger statement." I paused. The bulldozer was a last resort, but maybe, just maybe, we could play it smarter first. He pulled back the tarp to reveal his pride and joy. A 1975 Caterpillar D6 bulldozer that he'd bought surplus from the county road department 20 years ago. The machine was painted bright yellow, with Davis Construction stenciled on the sides in bold black letters. "Grandpa, please tell me you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." Hank's smile was the kind of expression that had probably terrified enemy soldiers in Vietnam and difficult clients in the construction business. "Jake, that fence is sitting on property that doesn't belong to the HOA. According to the surveys I pulled from the county records, at least 60 feet of that barrier is actually on public right-of-ways land, which means it's an illegal obstruction that needs to be removed. And since the city doesn't seem inclined to do anything about it, maybe it's time for some concerned citizens to take action." The plan Hank outlined was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. He'd researched the exact property lines and discovered that Stephanie's fence crossed onto public land in multiple locations, making significant portions of it illegal. Better yet, he'd found documentation proving that the road itself had been built with private funding specifically to provide access to landlocked properties, which gave us not just easement rights, but actual ownership stakes in the roadway itself. The way I see it, Jake, we're not destroying HOA property. We're removing an illegal obstruction from land that we have legal rights to access. Maria Benson arrived at my house an hour later with a briefcase full of legal documents and a grim expression. "I've been reviewing everything, and I have good news and bad news. The good news is that your grandfather is absolutely right about the property lines and the easement rights. The bad news is that Stephanie has been busy too. She's filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any interference with the fence, and she's claiming that removing it would create a public safety hazard." But then Maria's expression changed, and she leaned forward with the look of someone who just discovered a crucial piece of evidence. "But here's what's really interesting, Jake. I did some digging into the HOA's financial records, and there are some serious irregularities. The money for this fence project supposedly came from a special assessment that was never properly voted on by the membership. And when I looked at the other expenditures Stephanie has authorized, I found some very questionable transactions. There's $25,000 listed as legal consulting fees that were paid to a firm that specializes in divorce law, not HOA matters, and another $15,000 for security improvements that seem to have involved a lot more than just installing cameras. As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, I realized that Stephanie's authoritarian behavior might not just be about control, it might be about covering up financial crimes. If she'd been using HOA funds for personal expenses, then the fence project and all the intimidation tactics could be desperate attempts to maintain her position long enough to cover her tracks. The question was, how much evidence did we need to bring her down? And how much damage was she willing to do to the community in the meantime? Looking at Grandpa Hank's bulldozer sitting in my driveway, I had a feeling we were about to find out. Grandpa Hank called me at 5:30 in the morning with a voice that was so calm it was actually terrifying. "Jake, you might want to come outside and bring that camera of yours. It's time to reclaim our road." I threw on clothes and grabbed my phone, stepping out into the pre-dawn darkness to see the Caterpillar D6 rumbling down the street like a mechanical dinosaur. Hank was wearing his old Marine Corps utility cap and had rigged up a portable speaker system that was playing Reveille, the traditional military wake-up call, at a volume that probably woke up half the county. The sound of the bulldozer engine and the bugle call brought neighbors out of their houses in robes and pajamas, creating an impromptu audience for what was about to unfold. Betty Johnson appeared on her front porch with a pot of coffee and a lawn chair, settling in like she was about to watch the best show on television. Tom Wilson emerged from his house with his phone already recording, and even Mrs. Henderson made her way out to her front yard with the help of her walker. The only person who seemed unprepared for this development was Stephanie Foster, who came running out of her house in a bathrobe and slippers, her perfect hair in disarray and her face showing pure panic. Hank positioned the bulldozer directly in front of the fence and shut off the engine, creating a sudden silence that was somehow more dramatic than all the noise had been. He climbed down from the operator's seat, walked over to the American flag that flew in front of the community center, and rendered a perfect military salute. Then he turned to face the growing crowd of neighbors and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Hank Davis, United States Marine Corps, retired. This fence was built illegally on public property and private easement land. As a tax-paying citizen and property owner, I'm exercising my right to remove an unlawful obstruction." Stephanie finally found her voice and started screaming objections, but her protests were drowned out when Hank fired up the bulldozer again and engaged the blade. The sound of steel fence posts being crushed and chain link being torn apart was like a symphony of destruction that brought cheers from most of the crowd. Betty Johnson started clapping, Tom Wilson was live streaming the whole thing, and someone, I think it was Mrs. Henderson, actually started chanting, "Go, Grandpa, go," like this was some kind of sporting event. The demolition process was methodical and efficient. Hank would advance the bulldozer 20 feet, push down a section of fence, then stop to check his work and make sure he wasn't damaging anything that didn't deserve to be damaged. The sound of splintering wood and snapping boards filled the air as the cedar planks gave way to the bulldozer's blade, creating a satisfying, crackling symphony that brought cheers from most of the crowd. During one of these pauses, he climbed down to accept a cup of coffee from Betty Johnson and a sandwich from another neighbor, waving cheerfully to the crowd like he was the grand marshal of the world's most destructive parade. Meanwhile, Stephanie was running around the perimeter of the destruction, trying to get someone, anyone, to stop what was happening. She called 911, but when the dispatcher asked if it was an emergency or a civil dispute, she couldn't give a coherent answer. She tried to flag down the security guard she'd hired, but he took one look at the crowd and the bulldozer and decided his minimum wage job wasn't worth getting between a Marine and his mission. Richard Brooks arrived with what I assumed was the HOA's lawyer, but they stood at a safe distance, apparently realizing that trying to physically stop a bulldozer was not a realistic option. The coup de grace came when Hank reached the section of fence that had been built directly across the original roadway. This part of the barrier was heavier and more substantial than the rest, with concrete footings and thick wooden posts that had been designed to withstand significant impact. But the Caterpillar D6 had been designed to move mountains, and a fancy wooden fence wasn't going to slow it down. With a grinding roar of diesel engine and hydraulics, the bulldozer pushed through the final obstacle, cedar planks exploding in all directions like oversized matchsticks, opening up the road that had been blocked for the past week. As the dust settled and the engine noise faded, the full scope of what had just happened became clear. In the space of about 30 minutes, Grandpa Hank had completely demolished 300 feet of steel fencing, removed 4 concrete barriers, and restored access to the road that served 5 families in our neighborhood. But more importantly, he'd made a statement that resonated far beyond the practical issue of road access. This was about standing up to bullies, defending property rights, and refusing to be intimidated by people who abused their authority. The arrival of the police marked the beginning of the next phase of our drama. Officer George Martinez, who pulled up in his patrol car just as Hank was shutting down the bulldozer, was someone I recognized from community events, a calm, professional cop who'd been working this beat for 15 years. But what I didn't know until he greeted Grandpa Hank with a firm handshake and a smile was that they'd served together in the same Marine unit back in the 1980s. Instead of arresting anyone, Officer Martinez asked to see the legal documents that supported our position, listened to both sides of the story, and then made an announcement that left Stephanie Foster standing with her mouth open. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing here, it appears that significant portions of this fence were constructed on public right-of-ways without proper permits. I'm going to need to see your construction permits and property surveys before we can determine if any laws were actually broken today." The look on Stephanie's face as she realized that the police were more interested in investigating her fence than arresting my grandfather was priceless. But the real shock was yet to come, because Officer Martinez was about to uncover something that would change everything about our neighborhood war. Officer Martinez's investigation into the fence construction turned into something much bigger when he asked to see the permits and discovered that Stephanie couldn't produce them. "Ma'am, any construction project of this scope requires city permits, environmental impact assessments, and approval from the Utilities Commission. Do you have documentation showing that these requirements were met?" Stephanie's response was a nervous laugh, followed by a rambling explanation about emergency safety measures and HOA authority, but it was clear she was scrambling for answers she didn't have. Mike Rodriguez arrived from City Hall about 20 minutes later, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone who discovered something very unpleasant. "George, I've got the survey results you requested, and we've got a problem. This fence was built not just on public right-of-ways but also across 2 different utility easements and a drainage corridor that's protected under county flood management regulations. Whoever authorized this construction violated about 6 different municipal codes." He turned to look at Stephanie with the kind of stare that government officials reserve for people who've created massive paperwork problems. But the real bombshell came when Betty Johnson stepped forward with a manila envelope that she'd been clutching since the Bulldozer show began. "Officer Martinez, I think you need to hear these recordings before you decide who the real criminal is here." With shaking hands, she pulled out a small digital recorder and explained that she'd been documenting Stephanie's activities for the past 3 months. Ever since the HOA president had started making threats against elderly residents who couldn't keep up with her increasingly arbitrary rule changes. The first recording was a conversation between Stephanie and Richard Brooks discussing how to reallocate HOA maintenance funds to pay for Stephanie's personal legal expenses. The second was even more damaging, Stephanie explaining to someone on the phone how she planned to force out troublesome residents by creating violations that would be too expensive for them to fight. But the recording that made Officer Martinez reach for his handcuffs was Stephanie instructing Richard to falsify construction bids so that his company would win HOA contracts at inflated prices, with the understanding that he would kick back a percentage to her personal account. As the scope of Stephanie's corruption became clear, neighbors who had been afraid to speak up started coming forward with their own stories. Mrs. Henderson revealed that she'd been charged $300 for a property inspection that consisted of Stephanie walking around her yard for 5 minutes and writing down violations for things like excessive bird feeding and inadequate mulch distribution. Tom Wilson produced receipts showing that he'd been forced to pay nearly $2,000 in fines and fees over the past year, most of them for violations that weren't actually listed in the HOA guidelines. The crowd that had gathered to watch the fence demolition was now witnessing something even more dramatic: the complete unraveling of Stephanie Foster's HOA dictatorship. Richard Brooks, realizing that he was about to be charged as an accomplice in multiple felonies, started providing evidence against Stephanie in exchange for leniency. He produced bank records showing that over $85,000 in HOA funds had been diverted to unauthorized purposes, including Stephanie's divorce attorney fees, a luxury car lease, and what appeared to be several expensive spa weekends. The final nail in Stephanie's coffin came when Maria Benson arrived with a briefcase full of legal documents in the news that the IRS had been quietly investigating the HOA's finances for the past 2 months, following an anonymous tip about possible tax fraud. "Stephanie, you're facing federal charges for embezzlement, tax evasion, and mail fraud." The anonymous tip that started this investigation came with detailed documentation of every illegal transaction you've made since taking office. Someone has been watching you very carefully. The anonymous tipster, it turned out, was Betty Johnson, who had been systematically documenting Stephanie's crimes while pretending to be just another harmless elderly neighbor. As Officer Martinez read Stephanie her rights, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: genuine pity for a woman who'd started out trying to bring order to her life and had ended up destroying it completely. Her breakdown was complete and public, with neighbors watching as she sobbed about how everything had spiraled out of control after her divorce, how she'd only wanted to feel important again, how the power had gone to her head and made her do things she never thought she was capable of. It was a spectacular fall from grace for someone who'd been running the neighborhood like her personal kingdom just hours earlier. The media attention that followed was swift and overwhelming. Local news crews arrived to cover the story of the Bulldozer grandpa who'd exposed HOA corruption. And by evening, the video of Hank demolishing the fence had spread across social media platforms faster than I could track. Reporters interviewed neighbors about their experiences under Stephanie's regime, city officials about the permit violations, and legal experts about the implications of HOA corruption. What had started as a simple property dispute had become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny and bureaucratic abuse. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Stephanie, sitting in the back of Officer Martinez's patrol car, looked out at the community she'd tried to control and saw that instead of chaos and disorder, there was something that had been missing for months. Neighbors talking to each other, laughing together, and working cooperatively to figure out how to move forward. The fence that was supposed to divide and control had been replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose that no amount of HOA rules and violations could have created. As the patrol car drove away, taking Stephanie to face the consequences of her actions, I realized that sometimes the best way to restore order to a community is to tear down the barriers that prevent people from being neighbors. 6 months later, I was sitting on my front porch watching kids ride their bicycles up and down the road that we dubbed Liberation Road, when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. Stephanie Foster stepped out, looking nothing like the corporate HOA dictator who terrorized our neighborhood. Her hair was shorter and more natural, she was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, and most importantly, the hard edge of desperation and control that had defined her personality was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. Jake, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I needed to apologize. Not just for the fence and the legal threats, but for everything. I turned into someone I didn't recognize, and I hurt a lot of good people in the process. She handed me an envelope containing a check for $15,000, her contribution to the fund that had been established to compensate residents for the financial damage caused by her illegal fines and fees. I know money can't fix what I did, but it's a start. The criminal charges against Stephanie had been resolved through a plea agreement that included community service, financial restitution, and a 5-year ban from serving in any HOA leadership position. But the real change in her had come from the court-mandated counseling that helped her understand how her divorce trauma and financial anxiety had driven her to seek control in ways that hurt other people. She'd moved to a smaller apartment in another part of town, taken a job as a customer service representative, and started volunteering at a senior center as part of her community service requirement. The funny thing is, Jake, I'm happier now than I've been in years. I was so focused on trying to control everything around me that I forgot how to actually live. Losing all that power was the best thing that could have happened to me. There was a sincerity in her voice that I'd never heard during her HOA reign, and I found myself believing that her transformation was genuine. We talked for about an hour, sitting on the same porch where I'd first read her violation notice 9 months earlier, and I got a glimpse of who Stephanie Foster might have been if fear and insecurity hadn't turned her into a neighborhood tyrant. The changes in our community had been just as dramatic as Stephanie's personal transformation. Maria Benson had been elected as the new HOA president with the understanding that her primary job was to prevent anyone from ever wielding that kind of unchecked authority again. The association had been restructured with term limits, financial oversight requirements, and a resident bill of rights that protected homeowners from arbitrary enforcement actions. The neighborhood that had been divided by fear and suspicion was now characterized by the kind of cooperation and mutual support that made it feel like an actual community. Grandpa Hank had become something of a local legend, with his bulldozer stories inspiring similar acts of resistance against petty bureaucracy across the state. He'd been invited to testify before the Texas legislature about HOA reform, appeared on several veteran podcasts to talk about community organizing, and had even been featured in a documentary about grassroots activism. The bulldozer itself was now on permanent display at the local VFW post, with a plaque that read, "Sometimes the best way to tear down barriers is with heavy machinery and the courage to use it." The legal reforms that followed our case had implications far beyond our small neighborhood. Jake's Law, as the media had dubbed it, required HOA financial transparency, limited the types of violations that could result in fines, and established a process for residents to appeal arbitrary enforcement actions. The law had been inspired by the dozens of other HOA horror stories that came to light after our situation went viral, and it provided legal protections for homeowners across the state who were dealing with similar abuse of authority. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the sense of genuine community that had developed in the aftermath of our conflict. The annual Fence Down Day celebration brought together families from across the neighborhood for a barbecue and community service projects that actually improved everyone's quality of life. Betty Johnson had started a neighborhood watch program that focused on helping elderly residents with yard work and home maintenance rather than reporting violations. Tom Wilson organized monthly meetings where residents could discuss concerns and propose improvements without fear of retaliation or arbitrary rule enforcement. As I watched Stephanie's car pull away from my driveway, I reflected on how dramatically everything had changed since that morning when Grandpa Hank had fired up his bulldozer and torn down more than just a fence. He'd torn down the barriers of fear and intimidation that had prevented neighbors from supporting each other, and in doing so he demonstrated that sometimes the most effective response to petty tyranny is not legal maneuvering or political organizing, but simple, direct action taken by people who refuse to be intimidated. The road that had started this whole conflict was now wider and better maintained than it had ever been, serving not just the 5 families who depended on it for access, but also functioning as a symbol of what communities can accomplish when people work together instead of trying to control each other. And every time I drive down Liberation Road, past the spot where Stephanie's fence used to stand, I'm reminded that sometimes the best way to restore order to a community is to tear down the artificial barriers that prevent people from being neighbors. 2 years later, when people asked me about the bulldozer incident, I tell them that the most important lesson wasn't about standing up to bullies or fighting bureaucratic abuse, though those things certainly mattered. The most important lesson was about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even the worst neighborhood conflicts can ultimately bring out the best in people, if we're willing to see past our anger and work toward actual solutions. Sometimes justice doesn't look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like a former HOA dictator helping elderly residents with their groceries while kids ride their bikes down a road that used to be blocked by fear and barbed wire.